Hi, I'm Dimitri with XYZ Create, and today I'm going to be building a skateboard.
I started with a board of red oak that was 3.5 inches wide and 3/4 of an inch thick, and I measured out to 24 inches long.
This is actually a pretty long piece, so it's kind of hard to hold on the miter saw. So I have it propped up on one end with a couple blocks of wood. So I actually got quite a bit of tear on that cut. So for the next one, I'm going to go ahead and put a piece of painter's tape on the bottom to try to minimize that as much as possible.
Using the first board as a template, I marked out where the second board needed to be cut. The painter's tape helped out a lot, and this cut was much better. With that done, it was time to glue these boards together, and I'm just using a Type-Bond original. When clamping boards like this, it's important to use enough pressure to close any gaps, but not apply too much to where you start to bow them. It's also a good idea to clean up any squeeze out now that it's wet, because it's way easier to clean up than when it's dry. Using a straight edge, I checked to make sure that the boards were sitting flat. I left the board in the clamps overnight, and then it was time to take it out.
So next up, I have to attach the template I made earlier to the board. And to do that, I'm going to use some Super 77 spray adhesive.
I use the center line on the board to help me line up the center line on the template. Using the bandsaw, I was able to cut close to the line, but not on it. You can always come back and sand to the line later on. Also, one thing to note is I was using a 3/4 inch resaw blade, and that's not exactly recommended. You can get a way tighter cutting radius with the smaller blade. But that's all I had on hand, so I went with it.
So here's what the cut looks like directly off the bandsaw, and as you can see, it's not exactly the smoothest cut. So next up, we got to take this over the belt sander and smooth this all down.
Using a combination of my belt and my disc sander, I was able to remove the bandsaw marks and get the final shape that I was after. Here's the old crummy skateboard I took all the hardware from to use on this project.
So real quick, before we move on to the next step, I noticed that I made the original truck templates just a little bit too small. So I went ahead and made these new ones that are a little bit more accurate. And all I got to do now is locate them and stick them on with tape. And I'll update the original template later on.
I lined up the trucks to the template as best as I could, and then I marked out where the holes should be drilled. Using a 13/64 drill bit, I drilled all the holes for the trucks. With all the cutting, sanding, shaping, and drilling done, it was finally time to remove the template. Removing the template was easy, until I got to this guy.
So right now, the screw's sitting on top of the surface, and that's going to get in the way when you're trying to ride this thing. We got to make sure that it's sitting flush with the top, and we're going to do that with the countersink bit.
Next up, I was able to give the board its final sanding on the front, back, and the sides.
So next, I want to get rid of all the sharp edges by rounding them over with a piece of 220 grit sandpaper.
It's important to remove any and all dust before moving on to the next step, and I'm using my shop vac to do that. It's finally time to paint the board, and I went straight to color without first sealing the wood because I wanted the wood grain and the wood pores to show through. In total, I used 4 light coats, waiting 15 minutes in between each coat for it to dry. While I was waiting for the paint to dry, I cut out the stencil using my vinyl cutter. You don't need one of these, but it makes it a lot faster. After weeding out the entire stencil, I lined up the lettering and I applied a clear transfer tape over the whole thing. After getting the stencil in place, you really want to push it on the surface, that way you minimize any paint bleeding getting underneath. Here I am masking off everything I don't want to be oversprayed white, and I'm using newspaper to save on masking tape. And same as before, I did about 4 or 5 coats of white, waiting 15 minutes for drying in between. With an open pore finish like this, the chance of paint bleed is high, so it's always nerve-wracking removing the vinyl masking. Luckily, the surface was prepared correctly and the paint bleed was minimal. When I was applying the stencil, I lost the inner part of the last D. Luckily, I was able to scratch it off with an X-Acto knife and you could never tell the difference. With the painting done and the pieces knolled out, I was finally ready to assemble the board. This isn't the best hardware in the world, but for my purposes, it works just fine. And with the last bolt tightened, this board was done. I want to quickly mention that I didn't use any grip tape or apply a clear coat to this board, and that's because I was trying to match the vintage boards as closely as possible. And I really like the idea of the paint chipping and cracking over time, leaving the board looking used and abused.
I hope you guys had as much fun watching this video as I did making it, and I'd really appreciate if you guys would like, comment, share, and subscribe. If you want to build this project for yourself, I'll go ahead and leave a link down in the description below where you can get a free copy of the template I made. That'll do it for this one, and I'll see you guys next time.